choice and those of you who didn't. Both of you. We're very happy to have Dr. Paul Pilar with us today. Dr. Pilar comes to us via the U.S. Army, a tour in Vietnam, and 28 years in the intelligence community with the CIA. That's where I first got to know him when he was deputy of the counterterrorism center at the CIA. But more important, from our point of view, those of you who are studying about the Middle East or learning about the Middle East, Dr. Pilar is what I call an untangler. If those of us who have not been, how do I put this, living in a tree for the last few years, know that the Middle East and Iran are complicated. You can be an expert on Iran if you can say two things: I don't know, and it's complicated. Those two things will definitely make you an expert. Dr. Pilar, his specialty is speaking, making sense, and speaking clearly about very complicated issues. Let me just end by quoting something he said. He wrote in one of his recent articles, talking about opposition to the current process. I won't call it a deal because we're not at a deal. We don't have a deal. But opposition to the current process of talks, negotiations, meetings between Iran and the P5+1 powers, including the United States. And here's what Dr. Pilar said. He says, this is one of the clearest elements of symmetry between the two sides. Each government is burdened with substantial opposition from domestic elements that oppose any U.S.-Iranian accord. The hardline opponents on each side act and sound remarkably alike. Each never tires of demonizing the other country and attributes the most malevolent intentions to it. Each fulminates about how its own country's leaders are supposedly conceding too much and giving away the store. Each couches its opposition in terms of getting a better agreement, when in fact it does not want any agreement at all. With that introduction, please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul.
Thanks, Pat. Thanks very much, John. I'm going to try just speaking without amplification, but if anyone in the back is not hearing, raise your hand and I'll stick on a microphone. We are at a genuine inflection point as far as relations between U.S. and Iran, and I would say, and I'll get to this in a few minutes, U.S. relations and diplomacy in the Middle East as a whole are concerned. And we've had just in the last 2 weeks, two really significant events. Exactly 2 weeks ago today, we had the announcement of the so-called framework agreement between the P5+1 and Iran, and then just 2 days ago, we had some major action on Capitol Hill with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee marking up and unanimously forwarding to the floor the bill sponsored by Senator Corker, chairman of the committee, that purports to outline a process whereby the Congress would review any deal that's reached. I'm going to get to the legislative stuff in just a few minutes, but let's start with some background on both the Iranian and the U.S. side to where we've gotten today. And on the Iranian side, what we're seeing is part of a larger evolution of strategy, of fears, of outlook that has taken place in the 36 years, more or less, since the Iranian Revolution and the creation of the Islamic Republic of Iran. There's been a lot of change, a lot of evolution. This was a revolutionary regime to begin with, one that certainly in its early days had an almost kind of similar to the Trotskyites after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, thought that if they didn't foment similar revolutions in their neighborhood, that their own would die. Well, their own didn't die. And I mean, one of the realizations in Tehran is that they can have something or can seek something akin to normal relations with other governments that haven't been overthrown in their neighborhood, and that they can compete for influence in the region on many of the same terms that other less revolutionary governments do, and in essence grow up some from the revolutionary stage. And that's something that's not unique to the Iranian regime. We've seen it with other regimes that started off as revolutionary regimes. As far as the nuclear program is concerned, this fixation that we've had now for quite a few years, it began under the Shah. It wasn't a creation of the Islamic Republic. There clearly has been an interest in this regime in the past in nuclear weapons. Some work has been done on weapons, but according to our intelligence community, the weaponization kind of work ceased about a decade ago, and in a repeatedly expressed public judgment that General Clapper has conveyed on behalf of the community several times now, the judgment is that the Iranian regime has not decided to build nuclear weapons to date. The basic calculation that clearly has been made by the Iranian leadership is that their interests and Iran's interests are much better in a future in which Iran is a non-nuclear weapons state, and intrinsically related to that, can get at least partly out of the international penalty box that the regime has been in and move toward something closer to normal relations, economic as well as political, with the rest of the world. And all that implies in terms of getting out from at least some of the sanctions that they're under. That has certainly been the outlook of President Rouhani, and by all indications, it has been the outlook of the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, as well, even though the Ayatollah continues to be and continues to express a great deal of distrust of the United States and its intentions. He has given support to Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif in the negotiations, but he's left himself plenty of wiggle room if the negotiations fail, or if they succeed and the whole arrangement gets shot down by the United States, or more specifically the U.S. Congress. He has given himself plenty of basis to say, if that happens, I told you so, it's not worth negotiating with the Americans. But in the meantime, clearly he does support what the negotiators have been doing, as particularly punctuated by things that he has been saying and allowing to be said just in these last couple of weeks since the announcement of the framework agreement. There is no doubt whatsoever he is behind this process and wants it to go forward. And part of what he, as well as President Rouhani, are very aware of in taking that position is the strong, popular, public yearning for Iran to have a more normal relationship with the outside world, and everything that means in terms of getting out from under at least some of the sanctions and the economic improvement that that would entail. It was quite striking when Foreign Minister Zarif came back from Switzerland after the announcement of the framework agreement, and he was greeted by popular enthusiasm, crowds that were cheering him in the street. This is the kind of expectation which will be almost impossible to meet fully, even if the deal does succeed, but which the leadership, including the Supreme Leader, is quite aware of. So that's the Iranian side in terms of where they've come from. On the U.S. side, we've had a history of especially under the previous administration, some rebuffing of Iranian overtures. We had about a decade ago, when Mr. Rouhani was himself in the position of being basically chief negotiator, if we had any negotiations that were going to gain traction on the nuclear issue, and Iran expressing its willingness to make a deal 10 years ago, if not sooner, when they had a lot fewer centrifuges spinning. But the U.S. policy at the time was, we don't really want to do business with Iran. If you want to shut down your nuclear program entirely, then maybe we'll talk to you. But we had others, including our vice president, who basically said, we don't talk to evil regimes. The United States has pursued for most of that time a policy of pressure, which extended into the current administration, with increasing economic sanctions. The Iranian response to that has been to continue to expand their program, particularly uranium enrichment. Clearly, the policy of only pressure did not get the desired result. The current administration, although very much behind the pressure policy, was willing to take a different tack once there was a new Iranian president elected. And by the way, you know, another thing that was standing in the way of any kind of improvement in relations or attempt at negotiations was the previous Iranian president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, with all of the offensive and outrageous things that he was inclined to say. I mean, he became the ugly face of Iran for most Americans, the Iranian leader we really love to hate. And it would have been extremely difficult for any American leader, Republican or Democrat, to say, I want to do business with this guy. Well, fortunately, his term of office was over. Hassan Rouhani was elected in September of 2013, bringing a much different tone to things, as well as a determination on Rouhani's part to try to have a negotiation and make things work. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. The Obama administration responded to the opportunity, and in rather short order, we reached what became known as the Joint Plan of Action, the preliminary agreement, in November of 2013, and under which the Iranians and we have operated ever since, with a couple of extensions. That agreement was one in which our side, to put it quite bluntly, got the better side of the deal in return for rather minimal sanctions relief, with all the main sanctions about banking and oil still firmly in place today. The Iranians agreed to the basic parameters of what would be the final deal, that is to say, placing serious restrictions on their uranium enrichment program, foregoing and not doing anything more in the way of enrichment beyond the low enrichment level, under 5%, placing restrictions on what they could stockpile even at that low level, agreeing not to further expand the work at their Arak nuclear reactor, which had the prospect of possibly providing a plutonium route to the bomb, and agreeing to to inspections, which even under the preliminary agreement went farther beyond what any other country had negotiated for itself in the past in terms of frequency and intrusiveness. What has happened so far, I think, can enable us to say confidently that some of the skepticism that had been expressed before, that there simply wasn't the bargaining space to reach a deal, that the bottom lines of each country and their basic interests were simply too incompatible to reach a deal, has been proven wrong. The Joint Plan of Action has already done that. That's not to minimize the negotiations that still have to take place and will be very difficult and very hard, that are going to continue over the next 2 months plus, facing this deadline. And this, unlike the March date, is a real deadline. That's the date to which the two sides have agreed to extend the terms of the preliminary agreement, of June 30th. It's going to be a lot of hard bargaining still ahead to reach a final deal. We should not be confused by the spinning that each side has been engaged in these last 2 weeks, since the announcement of the framework agreement. And as you're probably aware, each side has handled the public rollout quite differently. Our side, because the administration wanted to emphasize to the public and to the Congress here at home how much we got out of the deal already, how much the Iranians have already agreed to, wanted to put as much detail into it as possible. And so the State Department released this so-called fact sheet, which laid out what's been agreed to so far, and which struck many observers, including many who had expressed skepticism earlier about what this deal would look like, as quite detailed, and indeed going farther than many people had expected. And that helped the administration in its difficult task of selling the deal. The Iranians, by contrast, have wanted to play down the details, and part of the backdrop to that is the Supreme Leader had earlier said that he would have preferred to have the agreement reached in one fell swoop and not do this two-stage business. So there was this much more general, truncated announcement that the Iranians made together with the Europeans' chief negotiator. And since then, there's been some squawking by the Iranians, I think is kind of pro forma squawking, about the extent of the detail that was announced by the State Department. My message to you is don't be thrown off by that. Both sides, in terms of the Rouhani administration and the Supreme Leader on the Iranian side, and as far as the Obama administration is concerned on the U.S. side, are very much committed to making this work and to completing the negotiation. Now, you heard quoted in the introduction what I had written earlier about the nature of the opposition in both sides. And that's still very much the case. I would say, while we do still have very much that mirror imaging of the hardline opponents to this deal in both Iran and the United States, I'm less worried at the moment about the Iranian side, for the reasons I already mentioned, that the Supreme Leader has made it clear that he is behind a continuation of this negotiation, and that he is prepared to be convinced that it, and to accept that it was worthwhile negotiating with the Americans after all. I am more worried about the opposition on the U.S. side, which continues to be determined and very active. And if you ask me what the sources of opposition are, I would summarize it by boiling it mainly down to three. One is the position of the current Israeli government, which is adamantly opposed to any agreement with Iran, even though, as many other Israelis, including senior members or former members of the Israeli security establishment, even though many of them realize that the deal really would be in Israel's interest in terms of being the best possible guarantee we can get against Iran ever getting a nuclear weapon. But Mr. Netanyahu's government has other things on its agenda that have led it to not want anyone to have any agreement, whatever the terms, with Iran. They include motivations of trying to keep Iran totally in the international penalty box so it cannot be as much of a competitor for regional influence with Israel, that it would be a less fettered competitor if the deal succeeds. It would be a competitor that also will continue to be extremely outspoken in criticizing Israeli policies, especially as long as the Palestinian issue is unresolved. That by doing any business with Iran, that tends to weaken somewhat opposition to Iran as one of the chief rationales for continuation of the extraordinary U.S.-Israeli security and political relationship. That it weakens the Israeli claim to being the only worthwhile partner of the United States in the region. And not least of all, that it would weaken the distraction that this issue, this specter of the Iranian nuclear program, has presented to things that Mr. Netanyahu and his government would rather not talk about, especially the Palestinian issue. I mean, every time something like that comes up, the immediate Israeli response is, the real problem in the region is Iran and its nuclear program. All of that would be weakened by the deal. So there are those motivations. You've got, as a second major source, of the opposition, partisan politics here in the United States. There's no way to get around it. I have to be quite blunt about it. If this deal succeeds, it would be one of Barack Obama's, it would be looked at as one of Barack Obama's signature achievements, probably his biggest foreign policy achievement. And if you're a Republican who does not like Barack Obama to have achievements, that's a reason to oppose it. And I think much of the opposition you see in Congress is exactly for those reasons. And the third set of circumstances I would mention, on which those first two sources of opposition have played quite a bit, is a more general sense among the American public that Iran is our enemy these days. It's the clearest adversary that we've had, especially since the end of the Cold War, although now Mr. Putin is doing many things that puts Russia very much back into the picture as a prime enemy. And the habit we have here in the United States of tending to see the world in Manichaean good versus evil terms, and the further habit we have of, despite the lessons we should have learned during the Cold War and from the policies of Nixon and Reagan, among others, that you can still do business even with an evil empire, that evil adversaries are not people we should do business with. So all of those are sources of opposition to this nuclear agreement in particular, regardless of the terms, and that's part of what the U.S. administration and its P5+1 partners are up against now. The balance of forces between what you might describe as the pro versus anti elements on this agreement are right now, in my judgment, about even. If I were to place bets on whether this process would succeed and not be shot down through political action here in the United States, and especially in the Congress, I'd be willing to make only about an even bet at the moment. The overall approach of the opposition has had several consistent characteristics. I'm talking about the opposition here in the United States. One is there is a reluctance to talk about alternatives. If we're not going to get this deal, or if it gets killed, then the first question that I think really needs to be asked is, if we're concerned about an Iranian nuclear weapon and we want to avoid one, what's the alternative? You do hear talk about a so-called better deal. I am absolutely convinced there's no such thing as a better deal. By the time these negotiations are over, they will have been going on for almost 2 years. They will have been very hard, very long, very detailed, very intense. They have consumed enormous time and attention of the U.S. Secretary of State and other officials. To suggest that there was, some way of getting a better deal by negotiating more aggressively is simply fantasy. And if we have any doubts, we can look back at the previous approach of pressure only, which clearly failed. As I mentioned, the response, the Iranian response, was and would continue to be now, if this were to be replayed, simply expanding their nuclear program or re-expanding it in the wake of the restrictions under the JPOA. There is a lot of doubt being raised about all kinds of provisions. You can go through that detailed fact sheet from the State Department and start raising questions about the uranium restrictions, about what's going to be done about the Iraq reactor, about the terms of inspections, about the length of the deal, even before you get into the sanctions question. And many people are raising exactly those questions. They are generally raised without raising the next question, well, what's the alternative? This, I think, is part of the reason the Supreme Leader was probably right when he said it would have been better to have, or he said before, he hoped we would have a single deal announced without this partial agreement, which gives the opponents, both in Iran and in the United States, lots of opportunity to nitpick about all the details before we have something signed and sealed. Once we have something signed and sealed, then I think the alternatives become absolutely clear. Do we accept this deal or do we shoot it down? And what's the alternative if we shoot it down? Another thing that we've heard about, and we continue to hear a lot about, is a lot of beating the drum about the other activities that Iran is engaged in or alleged to be engaged in that we don't like. All the things about regional activities. You know, we're on this different sides of an issue such as Syria. There is a lot of much more general talk about fomenting regional unrest and so on and so forth. And there are several questions I think you need to ask about when you hear this, and you'll continue to hear a lot more about it in the next couple of months. One is to look in greater detail to get beyond the generalities in terms of what Iran is actually doing in the region. I would characterize most of what Iran is doing in the region as responding to instabilities and conflicts not of Iran's making, but one in which, for sectarian or other reasons, they, as well as others, feel some affinity for one side or the other. I mean, a perfect example is the escalation of the conflict in Yemen, in which part of the latest phase has been the Zaidi Shiites, known as the Houthis, who have made these rather rapid gains and taken over the capital, Sana'a. The Houthis have accepted some aid from the Iranians. The Iranians probably have some influence. They are in no way a client or following the orders of Iran. They have Iranian sympathies mainly for sectarian reasons, the same reasons the Sunnis have the support, the much more vigorous support of the Saudis right now with their military intervention. That's the sort of thing that's going on. Another question to ask, which too infrequently gets asked, is what exactly are they doing here or there? How exactly does it conflict with or be consistent with or be irrelevant to U.S. interest? And that's a particular question to ask in places like Iraq, where we're basically on the same side in opposing the advances of ISIS, the Sunni extremist group in northern and western Iraq. And the final question you need to ask about this is, if we do have a nuclear deal, what effect, if any, does it have on other things that Iran is doing that they don't happen to like? And there the question to ask is, well, the main way I would phrase the question is, to the extent that we keep Iran in the international penalty box and treat them as a rogue state, are they going to do the sorts of things that rogue states and pariahs do? Or if they get partly out of the international penalty box, are they going to have that much more of a stake in competing for regional influence in more legitimate and less violent ways? I'll let you contemplate that question. The main arena of activity in terms of opposition for the agreement is Congress. There have been a couple of different legislative vehicles. There was one that would basically have in advance provided for slapping on more sanctions. It was legislation sponsored by Senators Kirk and Menendez that did not get enough support in the last session and pretty much was laid aside. So the main legislative vehicle has become this bill that was marked up by the Foreign Relations Committee 2 days ago. That was Senator Corker's bill. There's been an awful lot of debate, both by opponents and supporters of the agreement in these last 2 days, as to exactly who won and who lost with this compromise that was reached 2 days ago, in which the committee, Democrats and Republicans, unanimously voted to send a revised bill to the floor. And the White House said, after expressing a lot of opposition to this legislation, then decided on Tuesday, okay, it's been modified enough that the president will sign it. My own judgment is that the White House made more of the concessions, and that the opponents of the deal probably have a little more reason to smile today than they did before Tuesday. And my reasons for saying that are this. This legislation never really was required for Congress to have a role. I mean, Congress can pass a resolution of approval or disapproval or indifference or whatever they want on the nuclear deal whenever they want. They can use the power of the purse to take funding away from implementing it. What the agreement, what the legislation does basically, besides some poison pills which given the amendments 2 days ago, have been somewhat diluted. It does two things that I think the opponents of the agreement are probably happy about. One is it raises additional doubts in Iranian minds about the ability of the Obama administration to live up to the U.S. side of any deal. And it's going to make our negotiators that much harder for our negotiators to persuade the Iranians to take risks in making more concessions to get the deal before June 30th. The other thing it does is seem to obligate, even though it doesn't really obligate, but seems to obligate Congress to make a hasty judgment in voting on a resolution in the first month or so right after a deal is signed, rather than letting the process play out, testing the Iranians to see if they're going to live up to the terms of the deal before giving them major sanctions relief, and instead having only the minor kind of sanctions relief that the president could do with executive authority. I think the sooner you take a vote on this in Congress, an up or down vote, the more likely the vote would be against the agreement, and the more likely survival of the agreement would depend on the president vetoing the resolution and getting enough Democrats in either the House or the Senate to sustain a veto. That would be a rather ugly start to a new era in U.S.-Iranian relations, even if the deal ultimately survives. And as for a new era, let me just quickly enumerate what I think are some of the broader implications that go well beyond the nuclear program if this agreement succeeds, if it's signed and it's not shut down by the Hill. Number one, it confirms Iran's course that Rouhani and the Supreme Leader have set of aiming for Iran as a confirmed non-nuclear weapons state to become less of a rogue, less of a pariah, and having more normal relations with the rest of the region and with the West. It would give them more incentive to stick to that course. The more benefit they may get from progressive sanctions relief, if the deal is concluded and it sticks, they would have that much more to lose if they were to diverge from that course. If the deal gets shot down, you lose those incentives. And perhaps most important, you'd affect the political contest inside Tehran. Rouhani would basically be a lame duck. His policy would be discredited. The Supreme Leader would say, "I told you so, you can't trust those Americans." And those Iranian hardliners, including the ones who are still interested in developing a nuclear weapon, would have that much more influence than they otherwise would. So that's one major implication. A second major implication is that this deal would be a significant stroke in favor of the global nuclear non-proliferation regime. I mentioned, even under the preliminary agreement, but even more so what's shaping up under the final agreement, as we saw in the fact sheet, this would set a very high bar for any other country that has or wants to have a nuclear program. No other country has negotiated restrictions like this or inspection arrangements as intrusive and as frequent as this, as the Iranians have already agreed to. We've heard a lot of concern about possible proliferation cascades in the Middle East, what the Saudis would do, what the Egyptians would do. That's a legitimate concern. And that's all the more reason, in my judgment, to look at the terms of this deal, as we've already seen it in the State Department fact sheet. And my position would be to someone like the Saudis, you want that kind of deal? You're welcome to it. Now, what you as an unsanctioned state would want to submit to all these restrictions the Iranians have to get out from under the sanctions is a different question. But if you want it, go ahead. It's really good for the global non-proliferation regime. And the third and final point I'd make in terms of implications beyond the nuclear program itself is this basically would represent an unshackling of U.S. diplomacy and an ability for the United States to do business with anyone else it wants to do business with in the Middle East. A freedom that really we've restricted ourselves quite seriously right up until a couple of years ago. Until just a couple of years ago, US and Iranian diplomats were not even talking to each other. Now they meet regularly, and our Secretary of State and our Foreign Minister have spent enormous number of hours talking mainly about the nuclear negotiations, of course, but also talking about other stuff where our interests either collide or converge. Iraq, other things. Iran is not going to become an ally of the U.S. anytime soon. It's still going to be seen primarily as an adversary. I don't even expect we're going to have full diplomatic relations anytime soon. Remember when Nixon went to China, it took about another 7 years under the Carter administration for us to have diplomatic relations with China. It might be a similar schedule with Iran, even if everything went well with the nuclear agreement. But the fact is there are a lot of issues, Yemen, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, ISIS or ISIL, other forms of radical terrorist violence in which both of our governments have an interest, and our interests often converge, as well as other places where they diverge. It unshackles U.S. diplomacy. I'm going to stop there. I don't know if you guys are ever going to get a chance to eat your lunch.
As you're eating, let's go into questions, please.
What's on translation? Sir, given the reasons that you stated for domestic opposition to the deal, and kind of also you emphasized on the unnecessary nature of the bill that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee just approved, why would you say that all Democrats are going to actually approve that?
The question is, in light of what I said about the Corker bill, why did the Democrats, who were part of the unanimous vote 2 days ago, wind up approving this? I've talked personally to some of those Democrats, like Senator Kaine, who was in the lead, negotiating with this with Senator Corker. There is a strong and partly genuine, partly political commitment to this idea that Congress needs to have its role affirmed. And even if you accept what I said about, well, you don't really need this bill for them to later pass a resolution on the agreement itself, nonetheless, the bill itself is a very salient assertion of congressional prerogative. And I think it will be far easier for many of those Democrats, even if they eventually would vote in support or would decline to vote against the substantive agreement itself on the nuclear deal, that they can tell their constituents and everyone else, I stuck up for congressional prerogative. And it's not just they can tell their constituents, they genuinely, and honestly and for good reasons believe in that. So I think that's the main reason. And some supporters of the nuclear agreement have, in trying to put an optimistic gloss on this committee vote 2 days ago, and I think they have some validity in doing this, will say that for some of those Democrats, especially Senate Democrats, the fact that they did vote in favor of this bill will make it easier for them to support the agreement substantively in a later vote by saying, look, I wasn't just knuckling under to the administration. I wasn't just following Obama's orders on this. I've done my duty as a senator, as a member of Congress, to assert congressional prerogative. Now I'm going to consider the agreement on its merits. So I think those were that was the reasoning, and it's very legitimate and proper reasoning in terms of making the point that Congress has a role. Other questions? Yeah.
Sir, North Korea is a corrupt state. The leaders have a great area. Relative to the U.S. How does that impact negotiations at all? Arguably, more unstable presidential countries that nuclear weapons may could arguably impact that security.
So there's a question, what effect, if any, an Iran deal would have on the North Korea situation, or? Oh. Well, I'm not a North Korean expert, but my short answer is I don't think it would have much of an effect of it at all. I mean, those North Korean issues are so peculiar to North Korea. My short answer would be no. You know, where North Korea is often brought into this debate is not the effect it would have on North Korea, but what lessons are to be drawn from the North Korean experience for Iran. I mean, no, that wasn't your question, but and on that, there was a terrific op-ed in the New York Times just a few days ago, co-authored by Bob Gallucci, my former dean at Georgetown, and Joel Witt, who were a couple of the chief negotiators who negotiated under the Clinton administration the so-called framework agreement with the North Koreans. And many of the skeptics of the Iranian deal have pointed to that unhappy experience and saying, oh, we had this deal with North Korea and look what happens. They enriched uranium and they've already set off some devices. Gallucci and Witt made the point, I think quite convincingly, it wasn't the deal that failed. And one of the most important things about that aspect, about that history was the U.S. side did not necessarily live up to its side of the deal in terms of providing the other, non-proliferation sensitive nuclear wherewithal as well as more normal relations. In other words, the North Korean regime, despite all the lies that it says, had partly a legitimate gripe about our living up to the deal as well as the extent to which they lived up to it. Also, what really happened with North Korea was they had this totally undeclared uranium enrichment program, whereas the framework agreement was all about the reactors and the plutonium route. Whereas by contrast, much of the Iranian deal is exactly about severe restrictions on and detailed scrutiny of their uranium enrichment program. It really is not parallel at all. But on the original question, my best guess is it's not going to have much of an effect at all. It's the North Korea specific issues that will govern. I made my general point about how an Iran agreement, if it succeeds, would be a favorable stroke in favor of the global nuclear non-proliferation regime. The gang of thugs in Pyongyang don't really care much about the global non-proliferation regime. They care about other stuff. Matt.
Sir, in the future, as we see the closure of a nuclear deal, do you see the U.S. focus changing to Iran's role in Yemen, Bahrain, or Iraq, or do you see our focus remaining on the nuclear deal for the next generation?
I don't think it's so much of a change of focus, but to the extent that we can resolve the nuclear issue, and we can say, okay, we've made this deal, you've decided to be non-nuclear weapon state, we've decided to place all these restrictions and inspections, let's make that deal work. That will enable us to focus more on all these other issues where we have differences with the Iranians, as well as I say, sometimes our interests overlap. The President and the Secretary of State had made it quite clear we still have a lot of these other issues with the Iranians. We will continue to have those issues. We will continue to discuss and debate them ahead. And if you accept my final point about being able to talk to the Iranians, it will facilitate that process. So we're already saying a lot of things. We don't like Iranian support for the Assad regime in Syria. We don't like other things. We've talked about it before. We'll continue to talk about it. What the deal will do is keep us from being so fixated on this one issue and enable us to negotiate and pressure and do whatever else we're going to do on all these other issues of importance to us.
Unlike the time limits in Geneva and Lausanne, we have a real one.
Yeah.
So I would like to thank our guests and also to present him this souvenir book of the Naval Academy visit, and hope that he will come back and join us again.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good.